Good evening and good afternoon, everybody, and perhaps some, I should say, good morning. And so we are now coming to the end stretch of this BGR weekend retreat to welcome the new year with clarity, with compassion, and with courage. And in this session, I will speak a little bit about courage. One comment that was made yesterday when Venerable Chin Chuan was speaking about courage. He explained courage, at least from one point of view, as equivalent to fearlessness. And then we raised the question whether the Buddha himself has courage. But one thing that struck me while I was reflecting on that point afterwards is, in my way of thinking, courage is not identical with the absence of fear. Courage occurs when there is fear, but what courage means is that despite the fear, one proceeds with the course of action that one intends to take because one sees that there is a greater benefit to be achieved, whether for oneself or for others or for both, despite the fear that one will experience, despite the fear that one, or the dangers that one might incur. And I think back to, in my own experience, this was the time when I was in my last years of graduate school, working on my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. And I knew that I wanted to go to Asia to become a monk. And so I had to pay back my student debt. At that time, it was just something like $2,300, which seemed like a lot of money at that time. And so I was working, I got a job teaching at California State College at Fullerton, teaching 2 sessions in world religions. And before that, I had been a very introverted person, never accustomed to speaking in public, rather, as I said, introverted, easy to immerse myself in books and reading and writing, but to speak in public was terrifying to me. And yet I realized that once the semester began, this was during the summer, I would be responsible for teaching 2 classes in world religions. And I was so frightened, so terrified, that during that period, I developed insomnia. When I would try to go to sleep, my mind would turn to the challenge of having to stand in front of a classroom and to speak each time for about an hour about topics that I had to study in order to be able to speak about them. Because I was speaking not only about Buddhism, but also about Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Islam. So I had to study those subjects and lecture on them to the classes. And so I developed this real fear of going into the classroom and speaking in front of the group of students. And this was a time when students were taking over colleges and refusing to allow the teachers to conduct their classes unless they would institute this program, unless they would abolish that program. And I was afraid that this was going to happen to me, and I would have to face these students as they're challenging me to continue my class. And so at that time, I was going into the class with a great deal of fear or apprehension, but I managed to stir up the courage to go into the class and start to speak. And once I started to teach, then all of that fear and hesitancy dissolved away. And I found that I was able to speak quite naturally and fluently and comfortably. And I continued with that pretty much over the years. And so we say that courage is not the absence of fear, but it's the willingness, the determination to pursue one's aspiration despite the hesitancy that might be induced by fear. And what are the kinds of fears that block one from fulfilling the call of courage? Okay, one kind of fear, and it's a very real fear, and that is fear of physical harm, of violent reprisals, perhaps even death if one pursues one's aim. So this is a kind of fear that has to be faced by those, often by those who speak up for human rights, for those who expose corruption in government, particularly the type of people who have to live with this fear all the time are journalists. And so some of the people that we could regard as the models for courage in our present period are journalists who are willing to expose the truth about the situations that they face in various countries. In fact, I believe one of the professions in which there's the highest rate of murders among those on the job is the profession of journalism. In Latin America, in Mexico, it's quite common for a journalist who exposes political malfeasance on the part of the authorities to be murdered, to be killed. And in Asian countries also, that is a constant danger. I know in Sri Lanka, there were periods when journalists were being persecuted by the government, and quite a number of very prominent journalists were killed. This was in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And so in certain professions, one faces a very real threat of physical harm, violence, even death. And in those situations, sometimes if one has responsibilities to others, one might have to temper one's courage and not be able to act fully to fulfill the demands of courage. But in other situations, if one does not have those responsibilities to others, and one is willing to face the likelihood of one's own harm and physical damage, then one can come forward and speak up or take the necessary action to fulfill the demands that are imposed upon one. Okay, other types of fear that act as impediments to courage would be fear of loss of status, loss of position, or loss of material security. For example, if you follow the call of courage, if you're in a position of responsibility, then you might lose your job, your livelihood. Another type of fear is fear of blame by others, criticism, ridicule. Or the most sort of general type of fear that inhibits people is fear of stepping out of one's own comfort zone. I think one finds that fear largely amongst those who have the responsibility for doing public speaking. They might be the way I did when I had to begin my career as a college teacher. And so because one is afraid of appearing in public and speaking, then one has to, in order to overcome that fear, you have to marshal the courage and the determination to come out into the public arena and to speak. Okay, in today's world, I want to speak briefly about the areas in which courage is particularly called for. And these are exactly the areas, largely that I spoke about yesterday, as the areas where clarity is needed, the areas in the public sphere in which there is often a lack of clarity, which is responsible for sustaining practices, traditions, policies that in the long term are going to be harmful and destructive to the human community. Okay, so we can begin with, I spoke yesterday about the COVID pandemic. And we faced a period when COVID first appeared on the scene, that there was widespread misinformation was being spread about the severity of COVID. Some newscasters were saying that COVID is no more serious than the common cold, that it's just an ordinary virus and that we don't have to have any worries or concern about it. Or that it's not necessary to wear masks, that masks are useless, that it's not helpful to shut down the economy. And yet there were some people from the Center for Disease Control who spoke up, even criticizing the president at that time and the advisors to the president who were defending the position that COVID is not a serious worry. And so that called for courage, even though some of those people wound up losing their positions or they came in for very heavy criticism from the media. So that took a true act of courage motivated by a concern, a commitment to the public good. I think especially of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was willing, unlike some of the other people in the Trump administration who remained silent and just nodded their head, who was willing in a very delicate, subtle, and discreet way to contradict the misleading statements that the president was making. So that was an act of courage. Okay, another area in which courage is needed is that of speaking the truth about climate change. Because here, even the mainstream media seldom connect the bizarre weather events that we've been experiencing over the past several years, heat waves, droughts, drastic floods, powerful tornadoes, wildfires. They'll report on this as news events, but not connect the events and expose them as manifestations of a changing climate. So this is where courage is called for by a few news stations, usually alternative media, which will come out into the forefront and speak the truth, the reality about the change of the climate that's connecting these events and the underlying causes for those events, the underlying drivers of climate change, which is basically the consumption, the use of fossil fuels. And a few even more courageous speakers will connect our excessive use of fossil fuels to a kind of consumer-driven lifestyle, consumption-driven lifestyle, which turns people into consumers who depend upon massive amounts of energy to enjoy a constant stream of ever-changing products for their enjoyment, consumption, and enjoyment. Okay, a third area in which a great deal of courage is required today, and that is in addressing the problems of social and economic inequality and the intricate interconnection of social and economic inequality with racial discrimination, racial distinctions. And in this area, I find as an exemplary, almost the ideal model of courage, of outspoken courage, is the Reverend William Barber Jr., who is the co-founder of an organization called the Poor People's Campaign, which has been advocating for several years now, for about 3 years, for Congress and for the political administration in this country to enact policies that will address the needs of people who are facing every day, facing the challenges of endemic poverty, people who are homeless, who don't have enough to eat, who don't have health care, who don't even have sanitation. And so this takes enormous, not only courage, but determination and persistence to stand up against a political system heavily dependent upon campaign donations and lobbying from the industries and corporations that benefit from economic disparities. And then the fourth area in which there's the need now for courage in the public sphere that I pointed out yesterday is that of creeping authoritarianism leading to or tending to autocracy. And so this especially requires courage because there's such a powerful wave in this country of people who have thrown their support behind that tendency towards authoritarianism. We saw the manifestation of this almost a year ago with the storming of the Capitol in Washington, which was acts of violence, but not acts of true courage. The acts of true courage were exercised on the part of the police, the Capitol Police, who stood up against them. But what is the kind of courage that's especially needed today is the courage to call out this drift towards authoritarianism, towards autocracy, to expose the dangers in those tendencies, and to advocate strongly for upholding the norms of liberal democracy, especially to stand up in defense of voting rights, which is in a way the linchkey to protecting democracy in this country. So that requires strong surge of courage and determination, particularly when one is coming up against powerful forces, popular voices spread over television, over the internet, which are constantly confusing people and bombarding people with misinformation and disinformation. And if we look at all of these areas, these problematic areas that we face, the spread of the COVID pandemic, climate change, economic, social, and racial injustice, and creeping authoritarianism, what lies behind them, what sustains them is falsehood, lies, the dissemination of lies, that COVID is not so serious, or now the Omicron virus is really nothing to be afraid of. Climate change is a natural phenomena, not caused by our economic system dependent on fossil fuels. Social and economic injustice is just the natural byproduct of a healthy economy, inevitable, unavoidable. And if we try to change this by implementing greater economic justice, we're going to fall into the trap of socialism or communism, of which we should be terrified. And so courage is almost inextricably connected with a commitment to truth. And a commitment to truth depends on clarity, having a clear understanding oneself and being willing to investigate, to examine, to expose oneself to different sources of information, if necessary, to arrive at a clear understanding. And once one arrives at a clear understanding, the willingness to speak the truth in one's own circle of friends or to larger circles in order to convey the truth that will counter these harmful, detrimental forces at work in our society. I wanted, now I've lost track of the timing for this session. Okay, let me just see.
This session goes until 5:50.
So you have another 45 minutes or so.
Okay. What I wanted to do is to give a photographic exposition of some figures that I would regard as maybe profiles in courage, models of courage. And so what I'm going to do is to share the screen. And then we'll go through these photos and I'll say a little bit about each person. And first I want to show that there are some types of courage, that courage is not always coupled with clarity and with compassion. There are some types of courage which are admirable, even amazing, but are not connected with the promotion of any kind of altruistic aim, any kind of personal or socially beneficial aim. And there's one example of this that constantly amazes me. And this is, I don't know if you know this story, a man by the name of Philippe Petit, a Frenchman, who trained himself as a tightrope walker, a wire walker, and always looking for greater and greater challenges. And he was living in France. And when he saw the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers being built, his mind was obsessed with the thought, I have to do a wire walk between the two towers of the World Trade Center. And so together with a team of his friends, they traveled to New York City and they pretended to be construction workers who had a job to perform on the top of one of the towers of the World Trade Center. And so they set up camp there and they extended a wire from one tower to the other tower. And then on the appointed day, Philippe Petit wire walked on that wire between the two towers. You could see in the photograph, the Empire State Building is below his feet, and all of New York City is below him.
Bante, we can only see the small version of the photos.
Oh, really? Oh, I see. Then I have to. You only see the tiny version.
Yes, you might be sharing a window rather than sharing your whole screen.
Okay, then let me try. Okay, does this work?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so you can see him walking on the wire between the two towers, but the Empire State Building is here below his feet. And when the authorities in New York heard the report that there was a man walking between the two towers, they sent the police up to call him to come down, but he would walk back and forth. He wouldn't come down. And then they sent a helicopter, threatening to send a helicopter to pick him off the wire. But before the helicopter could arrive, he walked back onto the tower and came down. And they were going to arrest him. But instead of imprisoning him, he agreed to do a performance at a normal level in the park, in Central Park for children. Okay, this is another, I call this a profile in courage. And it just occurs, the thought of this image came to my mind just yesterday when we had the talk on courage by Reverend Jin Chuan and Jin Wei. Somehow this image came to my mind, and then I did a little searching on the internet to find out what lay behind this image. And I found that it's the story of a woman, at that time, a girl by the name of Ruby Bridges. And this is, I believe, in 1961. She is attending a elementary school in New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1954, the Board of Education, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court had ruled that, in the case called Brown versus the Board of Education, ruled that having separate schools for white students and black students was unconstitutional. The idea of separate but equal was unconstitutional. And so schools in the South were being gradually integrated. But in Louisiana, the process of integration was very slow. It was lagging behind the other states. And Ruby Bridges, she was the first girl to attend elementary school, an integrated elementary school in New Orleans. And there was a famous painting drawn of her by Norman Rockwell. It's rather small. The reproduction here is rather small. She had to be accompanied when she went to school. She was greeted by a crowd of white people who were yelling at her, cursing her, abusing her, throwing things at her. So she had to be protected by US Marshals. And when she went to the school, all of the white parents withdrew their own students from the school. And so I think for the first few months, she was the only student in the school. And all the other teachers also withdrew from the school except for one teacher who originally came from Boston, stayed on and taught her. Eventually, I assume the other students, the white students, returned to the school and the school became increasingly more integrated. But it seems that this would be a true profile in courage for a girl like this, just think 6 years old, to attend school facing so much hostility, so much resistance from the established white population of the city. And this is Ruby Bridges today, or well, maybe a few years ago. She's become an author of several books. And there's a documentary about her. And she visited when when Obama was the president. She was invited to the White House. And there's a little video on YouTube of Ruby Bridges and President Obama looking at the picture by Norman Rockwell. Apparently, they must have borrowed that picture, that painting, for the occasion. And Obama says to her that if it wasn't for people like you, I wouldn't be in the White House right now. So this we could take to be an example of a profile of courage. Okay, the next, did another photo appear?
Yes.
Okay, this is a man named Wesley Audrey, and he's not a civil rights icon, but he is a construction worker in New York City. And this is something that I heard about myself and I remember very distinctly, because at the beginning of 2007, I remember I participated in Chuangyen Monastery. We have every New Year's Day a interfaith prayer for peace. And when that prayer service was over and after I had the meal, a friend of mine drove me to my father's house so that I would spend a few days with my father. And the second day that I was there, in the evening, we were watching the news together. This is January 2nd. And the news reported a remarkable event that took place in New York City. Sometime in the early afternoon, Mr. Audrey here was standing on the platform of a subway station in Upper Manhattan, together with his two daughters. And there were a number of other people on the platform. And one of them was a young man who had a kind of seizure, perhaps an epileptic seizure. And he fell off the platform onto the train tracks. And in the distance, the people on the platform could see the train starting to approach the station. And so Mr. Audrey jumped from the platform onto the tracks. Since he was a construction worker, he had a very sharp eye for distances, and he could see that there was enough room between the tracks and this area between the tracks for two human bodies to fit. And so he jumped onto the tracks. He jumped onto this young man who was having the fit, pressed his body down and his own body down as the train came into the station and settled in above them. Then when people got out, then the train continued on, and Mr. Audrey and the young man came out safe and sound. So this, I would say, was a true act of courage, motivated by such a strong, spontaneous, deep compassion that Mr. Audrey didn't even have to think about, should I try to save him? Should I not save him? But just spontaneously, naturally, he jumped onto the platform and saved that man's life. After that, he was given a lot of accolades and praise and appeared on news programs. And the New York multimillionaire Donald Trump sent him a check for $10,000. This was in his businessman days. And George W. Bush invited Mr. Audrey to the State of the Union address this was in 2007. Okay, here's another profile in courage. Probably all of you will recognize who this is. This is a little girl. At this time, she's 15 years old. Her name is Greta Thunberg. And every Friday during the school year, she would stay out from school and sit by the parliament, the Swedish parliament, with a sign reading in English. It reads, "School strike for climate." And so she was just one lonely girl, very obviously extremely intelligent, extremely thoughtful, extremely committed to protecting the planet, to protecting humankind and life on Earth from the dangers, the disasters that would occur as climate change escalates. And yet people were looking askance at her, perhaps ridiculing her, criticizing her. But in time, her message spread more and more widely until she was mobilizing populations around the world to join in movements and marches and demonstrations on behalf of the climate. Not that she was the first one to initiate climate marches. I remember going on climate marches even 2013, 2014, I think 2012 as well. But I think the one who's given the sort of the widest, broadest international recognition to the perils of climate change is this Greta Thunberg, who is now, I believe she's, I think, 18 years old now. Whoops, I went too fast. Yeah, so this shows the kind of climate march taking place. I think this would have been in September 2019. This was at a time when Greta Thunberg came to the United States. And at that particular weekend, climate marches and demonstrations were scheduled all around the world. And the largest one was held, I believe, in New York City. And Greta Thunberg was the featured speaker at the end of the climate march. So this shows that if one has courage, determination, in her case, extreme clarity of understanding, one can bring about tremendous transformative effects. One can have a tremendous transformative impact. Of course, even though so many people now are conscious of climate change, but because of a very sterile political system, the actions that are needed have still not been taken. Okay, now I'm coming to some profiles of courage in relation to the Dharma. And the person that you see in this picture, it's a little image. I hope it's visible to everybody. This is the first Buddhist monk from continental Europe in modern times. In ancient times, there were probably Greeks who came to Asia and became monks. But this is the first European monk in modern times, the first person in modern times from Europe to take monastic ordination. His name on ordination is the Venerable Nyanatiloka. He was trained as a classical musician in Germany, a concert violinist, and then in conservatory in Paris. And he had a bright, brilliant career ahead of him as a classical musician. But he was also interested in philosophy, and he attended a lecture on different Asian religions. And one of the topics covered was Buddhism. And when he heard about Buddhism, his interest was immediately aroused. And then a short time later, his music teacher gave him a little booklet on Buddhism and told him, read this, it's very interesting, but don't get any crazy ideas into your mind about becoming a monk. But when he read the booklet, he got the crazy idea, I have to become a monk. And so what he did was to schedule for himself, because he didn't have the, I assume he didn't have the money to buy a ticket straight to Buddhist Asia. And he even had the mistaken idea that Buddhism was flourishing in India. And so what he did was to schedule himself to participate in a number of concerts along the overland route from Germany to India. And when he got to India looking for Buddhism, he was told, we don't have Buddhism in India. If you want Buddhism, you go to Sri Lanka. So he went to Sri Lanka, but in Sri Lanka, he was told that it's better that he go to Burma, where there was already at least one European monk from Scotland, from Britain, and that was the Venerable Ananda Metteyya. So he went to Burma, he was ordained in Burma, then he came back to Sri Lanka in 1906, I think, and he wound up establishing a hermitage for Western monks called Island Hermitage in 1911. During the war periods, especially during the First World War, he was brought by the British, because the British were the colonial power occupying Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon. And so the British didn't trust the German occupants of Sri Lanka, including the monks. And so they brought Nyanatiloka and his fellow German students first to an internment camp in Sri Lanka, and then they sent them to Australia. And from Australia, he was released on condition that he didn't try to return to Sri Lanka. And so he went from Australia to Hawaii. Then from Hawaii, he went to China and tried to travel through China with the hope of finding some Theravada monasteries in the Chinese region of Yunnan, which is just north of Myanmar. But he didn't succeed. In fact, he was apprehended by the Chinese, probably at the urging of the British, and he was imprisoned for 2 years. Okay, I won't go into a full biography of Venerable Nyanatiloka, but he became the teacher of quite a large number of Europeans who went to Sri Lanka to receive ordination, including the person who became my Dharma teacher, the Venerable Nyanaponika. So I'm somewhat in the lineage of Nyanatiloka. And he established, well, in his early years, he established Island Hermitage, which is in the south of Sri Lanka. But then in his late years, in his 70s, he moved to the upcountry where the temperature is cooler, and he founded a place near Kandy called Forest Hermitage, where he remained during his last years. Then my teacher, Nyanaponika, came to occupy Forest Hermitage. Then I came to live with Venerable Nyanaponika for about 12 years and stayed in the Forest Hermitage for altogether 18 years. Okay, next profile in courage is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, perhaps not well known to Western Buddhists. Dr. Ambedkar is an Indian, or was an Indian, born into the caste called the Dalits, or the community called the Dalits. The Dalits are the people that are regarded by the upper caste Hindus as the outcasts, the untouchables, those whose very touch is polluting. But he was apparently, even as a child, very bright and very curious. And so he attended school, the public school, but because he was an outcast, he would not be allowed into the classroom. He had to sit outside the classroom and listen in, sitting on a sack, a cloth sack, while the other students could sit in chairs in the classroom. And if he wanted a drink of water, a student would have to come out with a bottle of water, and the student couldn't give him the bottle or the pot of water to drink directly, but the student, he would have to hold out his hands, and the student would pour the water into his hands, and he would drink. And yet, Ambedkar did so well in school that he wound up pursuing not only college education, but graduate education, earning 2 doctorates, one from Columbia University, another, I think, from the London School of Economics. I think his degrees were in economics and perhaps political science. And when he returned to India, he was the one commissioned to be the head of the committee. When India gained its independence, he was the one who was commissioned to lead the committee with the responsibility for drafting the Indian Constitution. So he is often said to be the architect of the Indian Constitution. But the other side of Ambedkar's life, apart from his education and his secular conviction, was his religious contribution. He was born into the Hindu caste system, but he determined that he would not live his full life as a follower of Hinduism, and he undertook an extensive study of the world's religions to find a religion that would be most suitable for the people of his community, the Dalits, who are the rejected outcasts of Hindu society. And after studying the different religions, the religion that he decided most best served the needs of his community and the needs of humanity in the present time is the Buddha Dharma. And so in 1956, it was, I think, October 15th, 1956, he had arranged for a special ceremony with a Burmese Buddhist monk living in India to formally renounce Hinduism and to take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts of Buddhism. But he didn't arrange the ceremony only for himself, but he announced his intention to the entire Dalit community in the city of Nagpur. And 500,000 people turned up to take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts along with Ambedkar. And this photograph shows Ambedkar here apparently giving a speech. And these are his Dalit followers attending the ceremony. And when I was in India, 2019, I visited Nagaloka, which is a Buddhist center established by the followers of Ambedkar. And they brought me to visit this field in which Ambedkar took the refuges and precepts. They call this the Dhamma Chakra, the field of Dhamma Chakra, the field of the turning of the wheel of Dharma. Okay, the next person that we have as an example of courage was mentioned last night by Beth Coldring, who I see is living in Phnom Penh now in Cambodia. His name is Pra Mahagosananda. He is or was a Buddhist monk from Cambodia. He passed away, I believe it was 2012, at the age of 93. Okay, he was ordained as a child in Cambodia. He studied in Cambodia. He studied Buddhism. He went to Thailand in something like 1965 and remained in Thailand for 11 years, studying Buddhism and receiving training in meditation. But during the last period of his stay in Thailand, Cambodia came under the control of the Khmer Rouge, which was an extremely brutal, totalitarian political organization that massacred large sections of the Cambodian population. Cambodia turned during that period of the Khmer Rouge regime, it turned into a killing fields. All people in Cambodia who had been educated in the West or even who had received in Asia higher education were killed. Thousands and thousands of Buddhist monks were killed. I believe all the monks that remained in the country were killed, except those perhaps who were able to go into hiding. Anybody who represented any of the previous regimes would have been killed. And so there was a total, almost a minor Holocaust of about 1 million people in Cambodia. And large numbers of people fled into Thailand, where they were kept in refugee camps. And so when Mahagosananda learned about this, then he visited the refugee camps, and the people in the refugee camps had not seen a Buddhist monk for years. And so he ministered to the people, the thousands and thousands of people in the refugee camps. And then after the Khmer Rouge were deposed from power, when a more benign government was installed, the one still riddled with corruption and power grabs, he returned to Cambodia, and to bring about national healing, he would lead every year, I think beginning in 1992, he would lead what is called Dhamma Yatra, which means a walk. Literally, it means a walk for Dharma, but it was intended as a walk for peace to bring together all the communities in Cambodia, which had been divided by different types of political allegiance. Okay, here we come to the next picture. And this is a Buddhist nun, a bhikkhuni, whose name is, or was, Bhikkhuni Kusuma. In her lay life, I knew her well when she was a laywoman. Her name was Kusuma Devendra. She had studied biology, and she was a specialist in microbiology. And sometimes as a laywoman, she would bring alms offerings to myself and to Venerable Nyanaponika. But she was also a very devout Buddhist and very keen student of Buddhism. And so she gave up her professional career to pursue a doctorate in Buddhist studies, specializing in the study particularly of the discipline of nuns, of bhikkhunis. And at that time, as probably many of you know, there was no bhikkhuni order, no order of fully ordained nuns in the Theravada tradition, and the prevailing conviction was that the order of bhikkhunis is extinct and can't be revived until the next Buddha appears in the distant future. But Kusuma did investigation into this issue and found a way, a possibility, an opening for reviving the Bhikkhuni order. And she consulted with some of the monks, particularly the Sri Lankan monks who were serving in India, amongst them the Venerable Mapalagama Vipulasara, who became somewhat of her consultant and guide. And so she arranged, together with some of the Sri Lankan, we call them the 10 precept nuns, not fully ordained nuns, she arranged to go to India and to receive ordination in India with the participation of the Korean bhikkhunis and bhikkhus and the contribution from the Sri Lankan bhikkhus living and working in India. And so she became the first Theravadan bhikkhuni of the modern era. And through her influence, the Bhikkhuni order in Sri Lanka revived. And so now today there are several thousand bhikkhunis. And so again, this was a profile in courage, because at the time she took that step, she was subjected to extremely harsh criticism by many of the senior monks, as well as their lay followers. And when after she took ordination, she and the other women took ordination in India, they decided that they couldn't return immediately to Sri Lanka because it would stir up too much controversy and they would be subject to too much hostility and abuse. And so they decided to remain in India for 3 years before returning to Sri Lanka. Yeah, there's one more profile in courage I want to, add before we stop. I had it lined up, now I've lost it. Ah, did the photo appear?
Yes, Bante.
Okay, so this is, maybe some of you know who this is. This is our BGR Executive Director, Kim Behan. Kim joined our Buddhist Global Relief the very first meetings when we first started BGR. And a few months after BGR started, she developed a problem with her eye. And it turned out that she had developed a kind of cyst growing on a nerve connecting the eye to the brain. And it was a very serious problem that required surgery. And if she didn't get that surgery, it could have led to blindness. And so she went through that surgery. And in the period after the surgery, she had even double vision for several months. She felt part of her face paralyzed. I think she lost the sense of taste. But then after BGR started our initial projects, we realized that we needed an executive director. We were carrying on very much on an ad hoc basis. And so and Kim had been working in the telecommunications industry at a very high position with Avaya in Colorado. But she had taken a leave of absence when she had the surgery and when she was recuperating after the surgery. And so one day when we needed an executive director, we just decided to take a chance and ask Kim if she would become the executive director. So we asked her and she thought about it and she agreed to be our ED. And since then, I don't know how I can speak as highly of Kim as she deserves, but she works just so hard almost every day, connecting with our project partners, developing projects with them, maintaining relations with the staff, with the board. And so I'd say that Kim is a true profile in courage, one who possesses strong courage based on clarity of understanding and abundant compassion. Okay, so maybe that will do for this presentation on courage. And I think I failed to leave time for meditation. And
We have about 5 or 6 minutes, Bhante, until 5:50.
yeah, maybe we should take some questions. Okay, I'm going to end the stop share. Okay, I don't see any questions. So we would have a little more time for the sharing of the merits. Oh, I see one question. Somebody says, what about professionals like doctors saying COVID isn't that bad, that Omicron isn't bad and misinforming the public? What can one do about that? I say for us who are not, excuse me, not medical professionals, there's very little that we can do about that. But I would say that is the responsibility of those in the medical profession to criticize those doctors and to expose the errors in their judgment. And I think that there has been quite strong reaction to the, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But just avoid those kind of doctors yourself. Okay, maybe David, you can come in now. And
thank you, Bhante. And thank you so much for your your teachings, and I certainly echo all of those examples that you mentioned, in particular the last one. I also want to thank the Venerables Aya Amadipa and Jim Chan and Jim Wei and Kim and Trish and Yvonne and so many more who made this this retreat possible. And I'm always somewhat fearful whenever I thank somebody, because I'm sure to leave somebody out. So please, if you've been a part in making this happen, forgive me for omitting your name, but certainly you are as important as anyone else. You know, when I reflect upon courage and clarity and compassion, you know, I can't help but think of Buddhist Global Relief. I not only think about the young girl, Deva perhaps, who from an impoverished neighborhood in Port-au-Prince, who I had the opportunity to meet, but also thousands of other children, families stretching around the world, who this day will go to bed with a full stomach. And more importantly, or as importantly, hope for tomorrow, that tomorrow can be a better day. Because of Buddhist Global Relief, we started small. We had, I think our first year's budget was only $60,000. This year we will spend over $1 million in relief projects around the globe, teaching farmers who are dependent upon rain, which is now in scarce supply in many places, how they can adopt new techniques, allowing young women to go to school who otherwise would have to stay home and help to harvest the rice. You know, I think of one of the first projects that we sponsored, which came from Vietnam, where we provided food for people who were staying in a hospital. You know, we can't imagine that we would go to the hospital and that a relative would have to come and feed us if we were to eat. Yet that is the case in many parts of the world. We've done all of that because of people like you, volunteers and board members and all the folks who make up Buddhist Global Relief. And equally important, and in some ways, most importantly, those who have contributed financially as well as with their time and talents. You know, the work that we do doesn't just happen by itself. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. But it happens because of the generosity of folks who are attending this retreat. And I know many of you have already donated. I've scrolled through the list and I recognize some of your names, and it's good to see you here. But I would invite everyone, you know, who is here this weekend, you know, to also take this opportunity to translate your compassion into specific concrete action, to, you know, muster the courage to donate to this organization so that we might continue the good that we're about. Thank you so much for being here. And now I think I turn it back to Trish.
Thank you, David. Now we will hear blessings from Aya Dhammadipa and from the Venerables, Venerable Jin Xuan and Venerable Jin Wei.
Yeah, so I would just like to conclude by really just recalling the value of good Dhamma friendship, recalling the wonderful benefit of hearing the teaching, of being with folks who have such clarity and such compassion and such courage to walk this path, and to share about their understanding of their inner world and the larger world that we all live in. So may you be blessed by the triple gem, and may, together with those blessings and your diligence on the path, may you experience great fruits, the fruits of practice. And may those fruits of your practice benefit not only you, but all beings, known and unknown, seen and unseen, in all the realms, that they too might have the path to awakening open for them, the path to clarity and compassion and courage. I just want to offer a very brief chant, Pali chant. Bhavatu sabba mangalam rakantu sabba devata sabba buddha nubhavena sada soti bhavantu te. Bhavatu sabba mangalam rakantu sabba devata sabba dhamma nubhavena sada soti bhavantu te. Bhavatu sabba mangalam rakantu sabba devata sabba sanghanu bhavena sada soti bhavantu te. It means may you have all the many good blessings. May the devas protect you. And by the power of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, may you always be well. Thank you for participating.
Oh, just to echo Ayadama Dipa, it was definitely wonderful to be able to be in this retreat with everyone. And we'll just finish with a brief chant. We've done it before, so if you know it, you can join in. It's may we. And you can say it's a reflection on loving kindness, wishing for our well-being, for all of our well-being. And I actually think what's the other thing is very interesting is also there's a sense of equanimity at the very end. May we take care of ourselves and live with well-being. So there's a sense that each of us has inner resources to take care of ourselves. So there's a sense of this deeper support, the deeper support of each person's intentionality to take care of themselves. Okay. May we be safe and protected from inner and outer harm. May we be truly happy and deeply peaceful. May we be healthy and strong and physically at ease. May we take care of ourselves and live with well-being. May we be safe and protected from inner and outer harm. May we be truly happy and deeply peaceful. May we be healthy and strong and physically at ease. May we take care of ourselves and live with well-being. May we be safe and protected from inner and outer harm. May we be truly happy and deeply peaceful. May we be healthy and strong and physically at ease. May we take care of ourselves and live with well-being.
Thank you, Venerables, for sharing your wisdom with us. Ayadama Dipa, Venerable Jinchuan, Venerable Jinwei, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. And thank you to all of you who've joined us in practice this weekend. We will now hear the sharing of merits by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi to end our time together. Bhante.
Okay, so once again, I thank everybody for joining us for this 3-day retreat, starting from Friday evening with the blessings and then continuing through yesterday and today with Dharma talks and meditation. And remember that the purpose of this retreat is to give some guidelines for everybody as we try to navigate our way through the new year, facing so many challenges, difficulties, but we always have to keep ahead of us the light of hope, the light of the conviction that if we cultivate the good, if we commit ourselves to the good, we will eventually prevail over all the difficulties and challenges we face. No matter how rough the road might be, triumph always lies at the end. If one walks in the footsteps of the Dhamma, follows the Dhamma, that it said in some place in the suttas that the Dhamma protects the person who lives by the Dhamma. And so the 3 Dhamma guidelines that we explored over this retreat are clarity, to have clear understanding, to be able to see, especially so necessary in the US where there's so much falsehood, conspiracy theories, disinformation spreading. We need clarity. And where there's so much indifference or even hostility, we need compassion. And at a time when people are afraid to speak up, afraid to act in benevolent ways, we need courage to act on behalf of the good. And so now I want to end by sharing the merits, and everybody can also, along with me, share the merits. And so as we discuss the Dhamma, do meditation, engage in recitation and in meditations, we generate a great mass of kusala karma, wholesome karma. And now we want to share these merits we could share them with our departed loved ones, departed friends. And you can bring to mind any departed friends or loved ones, or living friends and relatives and loved ones who might be struggling with difficulties, personal problems. And extend in your mind the merits to them, hoping and wishing for them to emerge from their struggles and difficulties. And then we're going to share the merits with the invisible beings, invisible to our ordinary human eyes, but beings who are seen by these sages who have developed these supernormal faculties, the devas or deities, the nagas, celestial spirits, often depicted as dragons, the bhutas or the fair spirits that protect the Dhamma, sometimes forcefully and vigorously, and then with all beings throughout this world and the entire universe. So I'll recite the verses in Pali, and while I'm reciting, then you radiate the blessing power of your merits out across the universe. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu mang parang. By the power of our merits, may the powerful devas and nagas and other spiritual beings, may they protect the Dharma of the Buddha in the world. May they protect the teaching of the Dhamma in the world, and may they protect all living beings in the world, ourselves and others. Dukkha patachani dukkha, baya patachani baya, soka patachani soka, hantu sabepi panino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus. Now we go sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu,
Sadhu,
sadhu.
sadhu,
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 sadhu, sadhu, sadhu,
sadhu,
sadhu,
sadhu,
sadhu,
sadhu,
sadhu.
And let,
Thank you,
Thank
Bante.
you.
let me thank Aya Dhammadippa
Thank you.
and Reverend Jin Chuan
Bante,
and
Aya
Thank you,
Dhammadippa.
Venerable.
Thank you, Jin Chuan.
Thank you, Bante,
Thank you, Aya.
and
Evan
Thank you, Venerable
Jinchun,
Jinwei
and
and
Jin
Jinchuan.
Chuan.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Jinchuan.
Fisher, David,
Bante, thank you, Lord.
Thank you, thank you.
good work continues.
Thank you.
Everyone so nice. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Amitabha.
Wonderful.
Amitabha.